now like to introduce Thomas Duda, whose talk is on between structure and dressing, Herzog de Meuron, and the principle of dressing. Thomas Duda was a student in the MA History Theory program and is now an architect of a
Those? I'd really like to thank for the invitation for this symposium. My argument will directly continue Godon's argument, or start from Godon's argument, and then lead into a contemporary architectural issue, which is the architecture of Herzog de Meuron. The debate between Karl Botticher and Gottfried Semper in the middle of the 19th century deals with the question whether structure or surface is the primary element of architecture, or to say it in other words, whether architecture has to be understood ontologically or phenomenologically. Semper privileges surface. Thus, he is the first theorist in architecture who thinks architecture not from inside but from its outer appearance. This has essential consequences for the conception of space, function, and materiality. After 150 years, we start to understand the significance of Semper's thoughts and to put them into practice. The buildings of Herzog de Meuron show marked parallels to Semper's ideas, so that in many respects one can speak of a realization or even the continuation of some of his ideas. By first showing the debate between Botticher and Semper, I will introduce in Semper's ideas, or at least into his ideas about surface and dressing. After that, I will take Semper's view to read, to interpret the architecture of Herzog de Meuron. Botticher was a teacher at the Berlin Bauakademie for several decades and can be described along with Semper as a leading German architectural theorist of his time. His theoretical debate with Semper flared up over his book The Tectonic of the Greek, which was published in 1844. Greek architecture was understood as the highest architectural ideal of its time, and thus as the abiding expression of general laws in architecture. Within Greek architecture, Botticher makes a distinction between Kunstform and Kernform. You can see that over there. I just make this folly that you don't get mixed up with all these terms which I will introduce. Kernform can be translated as core form in English, and Kunstform as art form. Botticher means by Kernform that which is structurally necessary, the inner structure of an element. The term Kunstform he uses to denote the decorative dressing, that which gives external expression to the inner structure. One can clearly discern a hierarchical ordering of the concepts in Botticher's writings. The Kernform is das Wirkliche, the reality. The Kunstform ist das Scheinbare, that which is apparent, which should appear as put or added from the outside. So Botticher makes a link to the traditional vertical hierarchy of primary structure and secondary dressing. There is no immediate clash between Botticher's and Semper's position, but Semper's work is replete with criticism of Botticher's tectonics. Semper's theoretical work, as we heard in the lecture of Godona, is based on the polychromatic debate which was at its height in the middle of the 19th century. Semper declares that initially antique architecture and sculpture were not bare and white, but completely covered with color. This color had been washed away in the course of time by the weather, so that eventually there remained just the naked white structure. Semper takes the view that the forms of the temple were not complete without the missing color. He argues against the classicism of Winkelmann, who saw in the bare-puped forms the perfection of Greek architecture. Color, for Semper, Greek purity is not to be found in the naked form, but in the unity of form and color. Color or decoration are thus not to be regarded as they are by Botticher as externally applied superficial features, but as integral elements of the form. But Semper goes even a step further in criticizing Botticher's ideal. According to Semper, Greek temples were not only dressed with color when they were constructed with simple stones covered with stucco, but also when the valuable white marble was used. White marble, which had hitherto expressed the purity of Greek architecture, is for him no more than the base for the color. It is apparent that Semper is not concerned with an archaeological question. Semper turns the ideal of Greek architecture, the highest ideal of this time, on its head. The essence of architecture is not disclosed by the inner form, but by the color of the surface. The hetero superficial features are the innermost, and the innermost are external. Here we see a drawing by Gottfried Semper, which gives us an expression how he could imagine the coloring of antique temples. Unlike the other parties in the polychromatic debate, Semper alone generalizes from polychromy to a theory of dressing. Semper's theory of dressing, which is part of his book The Style, Der Stil, can thus be seen as a direct criticism of Botticher's principle of Hellenistic tectonics. In the theory of dressing, Semper distinguishes, as we heard already at Godona's lecture, and this will also be the last reference to her lecture, between Wand and Mauer. You see that again in my schema. Both terms mean wall in English. So in English we don't have this fine distinguishing between those two terms. Wand, the dressing, is used by Semper to describe the visible part of the spatial enclosure. By Mauer, the structure, he means the inner invisible supporting framework, which has nothing to do with the spatial enclosure of the room itself. To reinforce his thesis, Semper points out that the word Wand has in German the same root as the word Gewand, which means dressing, and ornament cannot be conceived as separate from dressing. Thus the concepts Wand, dressing, and ornaments are synonyms. And this will be important for the continuation of my lecture, to keep that in mind. Semper's definition of Wand and Mauer embodies a clear hierarchical orderings of the terms. He gives priority to the Wand as a true legitimate exponent of the spatial idea, and he designates tasks with the Mauer as to fulfill secondary motives. In doing so, he reverses Botticher's valuation. So, we can compare these two terms of structure and dressing, or Kernform and Kunstform of Botticher and Semper, just that the idea of both terms are the other way around, the hierarchical of both terms. But still, both authors keep to the unity of both terms. To better locate Herzog de Meuron's architecture within the historical context, we shall just touch briefly on the precepts of the modern movement and follow how Botticher's view was developed. According to Botticher, Kernform and Kunstform were inseparable elements of the same form. By conceptually distinguishing them, however, Botticher in fact prepared the way for the division of form. The functionalist architects of the modern movement took Botticher's concepts of core form and art form out of their original context and turned them into body form and ornamental covering. Limited to the demands of utility and purpose, the modern notion of function serves as a tool to separate Kernform and Kunstform. Form, in the modern sense, proceeds purely from buildings' constructional and programmatic requirements. The Kunstform corresponds to none of these and is divided from the Kernform and finally discarded. The Kernform is viewed as an independent form, already being able to express itself. Lack of ornamentation serves as a visible proof of the functionality of form and becomes an outward mark of the modern movement. It's very interesting to see that in the book Vers une Architecture by Le Corbusier, the dominist system is illustrated right next to the white Greek temple. The dominist system, which was understood as a schema, as a system, is illustrated as the temple as a form, already seen as a form, and a form which got rid of all external dressings. So it's a pure functional structure, as the Greek temple. Most modern architects have fallen prey to the belief that in abolishing ornament, they have abolished every type of dressing. So the bare structure is made into a modern ideal. The preference for fair-faced concrete, white color, monolithic constructions, and simple geometric forms can thus be read as an expression of this ideal. This paper will be too short to demonstrate that also contemporary movements in architecture like minimalism or the new simplicity, especially in Switzerland, that's why it's so interesting to see Herzog de Meuron's architecture, find themselves in the tradition of the international style and continue to strive for the ideal of the pure undressed structure. Let's go to Herzog de Meuron. The modern tradition forms the background of Herzog de Meuron's architecture. Herzog de Meuron's buildings seem to use the modern vocabulary, but regarding the idea of surface and dressing, they radically break with the modern tradition and continue Semper's ideas. As an example, I will show Herzog de Meuron's building for the photographer Remy Zaug in Basel. The building consists of a simple rectangular volume cast in fair-faced concrete. On three sides, windows and doors are set in front of the outer face. The fourth side is closed and the rainwater from the roof flows down the facade like a veil. The water washes down rust particles from the roof, drawing stripes on the facade which stay visible after the water evaporates. At the first glance, the building seems to pay tribute to the modern myths of the pure, undressed structure. But the building is not naked. It is dressed with a veil of water. According to the ideas of the modern movement, the veil of water, or at least the veil of rust, would be an ornament. since it has no structural or functional not structural or technical function, it would be considered as hiding the pure form and thus had to be removed. From Semper's view, however, the ornamental dressing would not be a secondary attribute, but the most important part of the building. Herzog and de Meuron dress and decorate the functional building structure and thus break a taboo of modernism. The scenographic effect is carried to an extreme when the water evaporates and for a short period of time the concrete building presents itself once again undressed and pure. But already the following rain washes again the modern ideals away. Herzog and de Meuron experiment with new dressings. They print leaf motifs on the glass of the Ricola storage building in Basel and photographic images and text on the facade of the Cultural Center and Theater in Zurich. In the project Kunstkiste in Bonn, Herzog de Meuron even used a natural film of algae on the concrete. All surfaces take on, in a very Semperian way, a particular textile character. According to Semper, a building is built up with the ornamental dressing. Structure just serves to support dressing. So architecture lies in dressing and not in structure. One could even say architecture is dressing. It is striking that Herzog de Meuron called dressings like letters or images printed on the facade building materials. I quote Jacques Herzog, "We want to see if we can use text and images as building materials in the same way as we could use bricks, concrete and glass." Herzog de Meuron privileged dressing because their main architectural interest is to achieve a spatial effect. Dressing directly addresses the beholder's perception and calls forth the particular feelings inside of the beholder. As a means of attaining the maximum effect, Herzog de Meuron focuses on only one architectural effect and makes it a leitmotif for the whole building. The rest of the building just serves as a background. As in Semper's eyes, the desired spatial effect stands above everything. According to his history of the annihilation of materials, the material of dressing has to be made forgotten in order to allow the spatial effect to occur. I quote Semper, "The annihilation of material, the annihilation of reality, is necessary if form is to emerge as a meaningful symbol, as an autonomous creation of man. Let us make forgotten the means that need to be used for the desired artistic effect." The Greek temple can be used as an example of Semper's theory of the annihilation of material. The colored ornament of the Greek temple creates a spatial effect, a religious mood. The visitors of the temple are deeply moved by this effect and thus forget the materials which has originally generated the effect. So from the outside, the effect created by dressing has to be understood as a spatial category. Enclosing of space starts for Semper with the dressing of the wall, not with construction. Space does not derive from walls which create a geometrically measurable volume, but from the dressing which creates a particularly artistic effect. Thus space, first and foremost, means for Semper not a geometrical phenomenon, but a symbolic one. I quote Semper, "The structure that served to support, to secure, to carry this spatial enclosure was a requirement that has nothing directly to do with space or the division of space, but woven materials almost everywhere, and especially in warm southern countries, fulfill their old original function as conspicuous space dividers, and even where solid walls are needed, these remain only the inner and unseen supporting structure for the true and legitimate representatives of the spatial construction, namely the more or less artificially worked and sewn together textile walls." Herzog and de Meuron proceed from the same notion of space as Semper. The spatial impact evoked by the material surface does not just occur in space, but it is space. The effect is to be conceived spatially, and thus has a sensory depth in it. Every time Herzog and de Meuron work on a surface, they are also working in architectural space. I quote Herzog. In fact, I wonder if one can really make a distinction between working three-dimensional and working in space. We treat surfaces as a three-dimensional object, as things that have depths, with spatial layers, virtual or mental layers for our mind or our perception, and physically real surface layers for our body to enter, to penetrate. Adolf Loos, one of the followers of Semper's ideas, gives a polemical description of the functionalist architect's way of dealing with space. And I just quote Loos because this makes a distinction between these two concepts of space very clearly. And I think also his critique could be read nowadays as a critique of Botticher. There are architects who do things differently. Their imagination does not create spaces, but walls. That which is left over by the walls is architectural space. And for these rooms, some kind of dressing is subsequently chosen, which seems to the architect to be suitable. But the artist, the architect, first senses the effect that he intends to realize, and sees the rooms he wants to create in his mind's eye. He senses the effect that he wishes to exert upon the spectator. Fear and horror if it is a dungeon, reverence if a church, respect for the power of the state if a government palace, piety if a tomb, hominess if a residence, gaiety if a tavern. Since Semper, space can no longer be understood as a dimension existing independently of the user, but as one directly related to his perceptions and feeling. Space is an effect of the viewer's perception. But the space which is located in the viewer is at the same time one in which the viewer is located. Hence, the viewer not only constructs the space, but also is constructed by the space. This emerges particularly clearly from Semper's declaration that the origins of mankind coincide with the custom to adorn the human body. I quote Semper. Adorning belongs to the privileges of man, and maybe it is the oldest that he made use of. No animals adorn itself. No animal adorns itself. By adorning, the longing for individuality is manifested. Because what I adorn, that I give a personal right to live, by making it its center of relations, which are only meant for him, it will be raised to a person. According to Semper, function and dressing are indivisible. The function of a building follows not only as a modernism from technical and constructional requirements, but particularly from the spatial requirements. Let's have a closer look how Herzog and de Meuron's architecture, how at Herzog de Meuron's architecture the ornamental dressing fulfills the function of the building. According in the project of the Greek Orthodox Church in Zurich, marble panels etched with a reproduction of old Greek icons create a religious mood and thus allow the church to fulfill its function as a church. And I thought it very striking, this parallel to Semper's idea of the Greek temple and how the temple creates a space and this example of Herzog de Meuron. In the project for the Kantonsspital Pharmacy in Basel, the dressing fulfills the function of the building by explaining to the exterior the inner program of the building. The green glass facade reminds one of the color of medicine and the green gown of surgeons. The facade becomes an interface which makes the complex interior understandable and accessible for the viewer. Let's go back to our old example of the photo studio Zaug in Basel. But in this example, the ornamental dressing does not bear any relations to the inner function of the building. In this case, the dressing with water fulfills the function of the building by veiling the inside of the building and thus enabling the inside to function by its own logic. The dressing functioned as a mask, obstructing the view to the inside, blocking the private space from the public space. But since the private space does not enter the public space anymore, the public space disappears. Herzog and de Meuron accept the loss of public spaces as a fact of our time. But the public realm is a precondition for the development of a communally shared language and thus for a common comprehensibility of the ornamental sign. So the loss of the public space leads to the loss of the comprehensibility of the sign. Adolf Loos already knew that the meaning of the ornamental sign changes with the cultural evolution. A sign can only be understood within its culture. Herzog de Meuron questioned whether a common culture still exists nowadays. This would mean that the meaning of the sign changes so fast that the sign itself becomes meaningless. The critical quality of Herzog de Meuron's approach is that they do not avoid this crisis of the sign, but become face to face with it, making it a subject. They face the constantly changing meaning of the sign by artificially accelerating the changes of its meaning. Let's take an example for what I wanted to say. In this project by Herzog de Meuron, which is a Pfaffenholz Sports Center, also near Basel, Herzog de Meuron exposed the supposed fixed attributes of the materials concrete and glass as products of our habit. Let me explain that. The project consists of a changing room building and a sports hall. The changing room building is the first building, and the other one, the sports hall, the second building behind it. The sports hall The sports hall is dressed in green tilted glass plates, which you see on the left side, on which are printed photographic images of the insulation sheets that lie behind them. The changing room building is covered with concrete panels, which have printed on them a pebble-like structure, a pebble-like pattern. It's not called structure. Herzog and de Meuron manipulate the surfaces of glass and concrete and thus change the characteristic appearance of these materials. The glass on the left side seems to be opaque and to take on weight, while the concrete loses its hardness and appears light. The two materials come to resemble one another and even melt into one another. In this way, Herzog de Meuron emphasized that there is no natural character of the material, not that the material determines the central properties of the surface, but the surface determines those of the material. Already with Semper, the material starts to melt under the surface. In the theory of dressing, Semper describes that in the course of history, the material of the dressing changes, but the language of the textiles is carried over. In other words, dressing is a constant factor. The material is a variable one. Semper calls this process the transformation of materials, Stoffwechsel in German, which has 2 or 3 meanings. But I don't want to talk about the other meanings. Herzog de Meuron draw the final consequence from this theory and perform what Semper was not ready to perform, or didn't want to perform. With Semper, the material melts under the dressing, With Herzog de Meuron, the material dissolves in favor for the appearance. The material is not able to oppose the virtual world because it is part of it itself. The things and their essential properties do not exist by themselves, but only by our perception. Material is a phenomenon of dressing. I quote Herzog: "By themselves, things do not mean anything. Their physical presence alone doesn't make them alive. In fact, they don't even exist. They need their natural and artificial content to let them to be seen in a specific way, so that they can become things of our perception, so that they can be named, so that they are being." Let's conclude. It becomes apparent that the discussion between Botticher and Semper in the middle of the 19th century was less a contemporary debate or controversy than a debate about basic architectural principles. At issue is the central question of whether architecture can be thought of independently of human perception or not. Whether architecture is something in itself or appearance. Whether it has to be understood ontologically or phenomenologically. The terms structure and dressing open up the whole field of the architectural debate. Botticher and his modern followers, the functional followers to specify, locate the essence in structure, in the thing itself, which exists independently of the human perception. Sempers see this character of architecture in the dressing, in its appearance. He charges the Materialisten, the materialists, which is a often used term in the style, among whom he counts Botticher, with having welded the idea too much to the material. The notion of structure and dressing has got its roots deeply in the metaphysical tradition. Structure was always concerned with the real nature of things, the idea, and therefore associated with the true and the good. Dressing, however, was always considered to be of secondary importance and associated with the superficial. Up to this day, our thinking of architecture is deeply influenced by this tradition. In the fields of architecture, Semper was the first who theoretically questioned the metaphysical value system and turned it onto its head. Thus, after Semper, architecture has completely to be rethought. The Semperian era has just started.
I
Um, I'm aware that I'm simplifying the argumentation in order to make it clearer. And as an example, it may can serve that I was only mentioning that dressing in Semper's view had to react on the viewer's perception, and so it was just concerned with the effect which it performs on the viewer. Semper also or doesn't want to get rid of the idea of dressing as illustrating the structure, the structural function, for example. Or at other points he particularly clearly emphasizes that dressing has got a historical component within it. So dressing is not clearly only used in Semper's view as something which performs to the outside, but also to the inside and also to history. So it's much more complex. That's clear. I was leaving that out to show more clearly my argumentation, and especially because I was more interested in the modern debate of it, and I understand myself as an architect, not as a historian. But you're absolutely right in that, I think. The idea of dressing not being understood as a separate form in addition to the structure is, in my view, a very, very important point. And if one does so, I think one could not argument to that extent for Herzog de Meuron as a somebody who takes up Semper's ideas, because I think although what makes it is a little bit up is that Herzog de Meuron always only use dressing, or in most cases, as a facade. So in this way, Herzog de Meuron is very much, or still very much in the modern notion of dressing as something separate from the inner structure, as an addition to it. And I think in this way they are kids of modernism. Still, the idea of the effect which is created by dressing can only be thought when you don't think dressing is something separate, as a separate form from structure. So the idea of creating effect, creating a mood, has nothing to do with a formal distinction between structure and dressing. And that's what makes so interesting and, for me, the architecture of Herzog de Meuron. And I also think it's a very interesting contribution to the contemporary debate, the architecture of Herzog de Meuron, because a lot of discussions in architecture are only done as formal discussions. The whole idea of the smooth space and so on. And this is a completely different agenda. Herzog de Meuron, in my view, are not so much interested in complex spaces, in complex space relationships, but especially in this notion of space, which is the notion of space as an effect.
It seems to me that, to be fair to Botticher, that he recognized the complexity, the complex relationship between surface and form, more than, sorry, I'm missing part of what you speak, more than what you give him credit for. He speaks in a way that is almost strikingly similar to the quote of by Herzog, when he quotes at the very end of your paper. What he says is that the core form, without its art form, has almost no being, because it is, I think, it is pure working, it is pure structural working, and it needs, essentially needs,
Exactly.
the expression that it can get from the allegorical dressing.
Exactly.
And in that sense, the distinction between Semper and Botticher, which Semper was very keen on maintaining, he was very rude about it, always, ambitious to mystical from Berlin. That distinction is not as clear cut as Semper himself would like to see
No, that is
Or uses the surface.
Uses the surface, yeah.
that is clearly right, and this is why I always try to emphasize that they never try to separate or think these two terms as two forms. They always emphasize that the unity of both is what they want to achieve, but it's like more a functional distinguishing of both terms and not a formal distinguishing. And but still, in this functional distinguishing of Kunstform and Kernform, there is a hierarchical ordering of those. That one function is more important than the other function. So Botticher goes for the structural function, which is more important, and then needs after that external expression. And Semper does it the other way. He says first the expression, because it has an effect on the beholder, and it is a historical has a historical component into it, and a symbolic component. And then we need a structure to hold that up. But it's always thought as a unity. And it's a completely modern understanding to think these functional distinguishing as a formal distinguishing. And in a way, Herzog de Meuron are still trapped into that. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to apply the whole theory of Semper to Herzog de Meuron, not at all. I just want to take one aspect out of Semper's ideas, which I simplify, of course, in order to make it more clear. And by this aspect, I want to read the architecture of Semper. I think it's also a problem or an issue of interpretation, that in interpretation you always leave away things to say something, and this is what I try to. Yes. This is what I wanted to say in the second part, or in a passage in the second part of my lecture, that it is very interesting that a lot of dressings of Herzog de Meuron's have no relation to the inside. It's like an arbitrary sign. It's like one of these a multimedia sign which becomes meaningless. But at the same time, it has a function because it is hiding the inside. It is working as a anonymous mask of those buildings, and that is what I wanted to point out, that although on the first glance it doesn't seem to have a function for the building, it is still functional for the building, because exactly is functional because it has no relation to the building. It's like a blocking of the private space of the building to the outside.
Right. Isn't this, what do you call it, a graphic quality of the image something to do with registering the translucence of material in a kind of generic way? What I'm thinking is that in all the talk of whiteness, there's been not much distinction between the whiteness of whitewash and the whiteness of marble. So the whiteness of marble is waxy, it's translucent, there is a perception of movement and depth, there's striation in marble. And that quality of self-difference within it is increased when you use crazed marble. Now this is exactly what Lord and Mies van der Rohe were, that the crazing of the marble is intrinsic to the substance of the marble. It's not just addressing, you can only keep the marble itself as addressing, the lamination. Now the problem with concrete is that it's granular and originally liquid nature. It's so utterly matte and uniform that it is a kind of empty science, and in some sense it's equivalent to transparency, the pure opacity and the pure transparency. Concrete is somehow complementary, and it seems to me that what Herzog de Meuron is trying to do is somehow return both glass and concrete to the condition of self-difference that material would with marble.
Yes. But at this point, I want to get back to Andrew Benjamin's remark and say, when I write structure here, then in the first point, I don't mean the structure inside of the building, not the formal structure, but I read dressing and structure really as a functional distinction. I'm not so much concerned about the brick walls of the Tate Gallery, but really yes. So I want to read this distinction really as a functional distinction, not so much as a formal distinction.
But perhaps in a way that's the problem of the way in which you set up the problem. That is to say,
Yes,
you
that's good.
you treat the difference between Botticher and Semper as if on the one hand there's an acceptance of an antique distinction between structure and appearance, and that Semper is simply a kind of reversal of that traditional opposition. Whereas, I mean, I think the point is that you can't accept, first of all, kind of Botticher's initial kind of premise and Semper's difference without looking at the transformations which would occur in terms of the definition, first of all, of the surface, and secondly, even the definitions of what would count at a very preliminary level as the interior and exterior of the building. So, as it were, it's not just that you can make a straight reversal and then derive the Herzog de Meuron, because you're dealing with kind of different regimes of how a surface and how the perception of interiority and exteriority would relate to it as well. You change one, you change the whole thing. So I think on the one hand, the Botticher is only, as it were, a diagrammatic presentation of an argument rather than a representation of an architectural situation. And therefore, the situation is inevitably more complex. I think that, hang on, Patrick.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, I'd like to thank Thomas very much. Thank you. Can I ask the first speaker this afternoon, who will be known to anyone at the AA, is John Outram, the architect of John Outram Associates, who is going to speak on scripted surfaces. John.
Right. First, my script. I've got about 1 minute of script, and then I do my show and tell. I think I use surface in two ways. The first is to destroy illusion, and the second is to destroy reality. I think my technique is to make these the same, so that they can't be distinguished. This is technically difficult, but very easy to understand. I do this by using materials which have what I call a deep structure, where the surface and the structure are the same. The reason I do this is to install ideas, and I use an architectural rhetoric of considerable elaboration to embody ideas as reified presences in natural space. This is, in fact, a professionally dangerous strategy, as it opens architecture to invasion by media, charlatans, and artists. But I have to accept this danger. I had to resign from a £500 million competition that I won and worked on for 6 months, because, in fact, it was going to be run from Las Vegas, which I'm afraid I won't be able to have time to show you any slides about. But for me, a human's life space needs to be invested with ideas. Right, now the show and tell. I became an architect when I was learning to be a pilot in America, and my most complete building is in America. And this is me, this is my architecture carrying over, oh, that's where I got these things, carrying over what I call the natural community. And these are the fields of America. Now, this architectural contraption, what it does is it hunts about to try to find a congruence between what I call the natural community and a lovely site. And it very seldom does. So what it usually does is it ends up on a plane of flat mud, which is in fact what Houston was built on. It's called the gunboat, named after Acadian soup. And so, oh, can you hear me if I shout? No. All right. Is that better, like that? Okay. So what has to happen, in fact, is this architectural machine has to work on the imagination. Now, this is a piece of Vedic iconography where a hearth, a fire, floats around on a nest of twigs until it roots itself on the ground. I mean, I'm going to have to jump about a bit here because we've only got 30 minutes. And this is where I've represented this on the roof garden of the Judge Institute. Here's what I call Hestia's cone. Here's the raft, and here is the sea. Here's the water seen in kind of cubist perspective. This is some green crushed concrete. We'll come to that later. Now, what happens when this contraption lands is an act of violence. This is what Ricoeur calls the time of conception, or the time of the beginning. And out of this act of violence flows what he also calls somatic time. This is, in fact, a Vedic iconography. I found it confirmed in the columns of Uzbekistan, which is its clearest. But anyway, I haven't got time to go into that. But we'll see how it kind of works. It has 4 registers, but anyway, we'll. Okay, this is a shopping center in the middle of Den Haag, where you can see the. Hold on. You can see this sort of cataclysmic event, which is the act of conception, which you need in order to land, really, and start the whole thing working. And this is the representation of its opposite, which is the mountain, which is the heap, this sort of stratified heap. I first bumped into Semper in 1961 in the 5th year here, and I obviously totally misconceived him because I thought he was for the primitive hut, but I'm immensely glad to hear today that he was against it, which is a great relief. Now, this is my building in Houston, which is what I call the room of temporalities. It consists of a kind of weaving together of all the different kinds of time. We'll sort of explain it, you know, as we go, like Levi Strauss backing into the future. I'll talk about that bit later. These are strange columns that you can see you can walk through, and this is a sign of infinity, which represents the ocean, and this is a river, this is a hypostyle, so on and so forth. Okay, now, you see, I read the 19th century as a sort of top-down strategy, and the 20th century as a bottom-up strategy, which had 3 components, revolution, enfranchisement, and the mass market, of which apparently the only one left is the mass market. My strategy is to go sideways. I think the mastering of a medium, any medium really, leads to wisdom. And this is a man who is hoping for wisdom. He is addressing the figure of a mountain. This is the figure called the coffer, which is called the cassone in Italian and the coffre in French, and it means a chest. It's a thing you keep valuables in. And this is what he's looking for. He's looking for illumination. I think it was Dresser. He always tried to find this particular variety of flower, which is a profound mistake. It is simply, it has about 3 significations for me. It's the hearth fire, the idea in darkness. This is always a dark blue ground. And I suppose the sun, a sort of skylight. Anyway, this is time and so on. Now, architecture seems to... Now, I've talked about this sort of strange contraption that there's 2 significances to the entablature. What I was showing there was the entablature. One is syntactic and the other is lexical. And it's usually the lexical one that's talked about. Its significance as a raft. But what it does is it lands on a forest. Now, the forest... You see, I think architecture is obviously a very old medium, and it's curious how it keeps repeating itself, if you like. But therefore, I think you can use natural analogies if you want to operate the mechanism. And this is the analogy of the forest. And the forest, you know, when you're lost in a forest, you're in a space which repeats itself infinitely. That's the peculiar quality of being lost in a forest. Every tree is the same, every space is the same, and time doesn't flow. And so these people who are lost in the forest, they find a little stream, you see, and immediately one puts his hand in the stream, and in his mind's eye, he sees the stream going all the way down to the ocean. Now, I kind of arrived at this idea by studying the paintings of Claude, who's the only romantic landscape artist I actually like. But I could give a whole lecture on Claude, but the thing about Claude is he always paints the same picture iconographically, and it's always a structure of a valley, which is always a kind of architectural progression. And I think what he's painting is what I call the natural community. Gustav Glotz says that the polis, the Greek city-state, for which we don't have a word in English, is in fact a valley. So what I think, this idea of architecture as a vessel for democracy that Semper talks about is, I think, quite interesting, because we associate classical architecture with the absolute state and the police state and a kind of hieratic organization of society with forelock-pulling, individuals and clever bureaucrats like architects. Whereas, in fact, the Greeks, I think, built. They never wanted a state bigger than that, because they knew that if by keeping this state as a sort of physical entity, they could keep its constitution, in fact, completely chaotic. They had absolutely no bureaucratic administration to speak of, really. So what I do for my clients, I build them Greek city-states, you see. I actually build them a microcosm. I build them mountains and valleys, and inside them they can be as chaotic and brilliant as the Greeks were. So this is the interior of this Faculty of Engineering in Rice. So you can see the valley here. This is another floor down here. So this is an image. There's another aspect to infinity, which is the ocean. So this is how this infinite forest comes out of the ocean. This is the myth. This is the Greek Noah myth, which is celebrated in only one city that I know still, which is Larnaca in Cyprus, where they celebrate Pentecost as Cataclysmos. And they actually do, and I'm trying to go there this year, though it's rather late, I'll get rather fried by the sun. But this pair, when they're asked by Zeus, after the ark has landed and everybody's wiped out, they say, what would you like? What would you really like? No, in fact, it was Themis, who was Zeus's second wife. And they said, well, actually, we'd rather like the human race back again, if you don't mind. And so he said, well, you must do a strange procedure, which I haven't got time. But basically, they threw stones over their shoulders, and people sprang up. And I think if they'd been architects, columns would have sprung up. because Serlio talks of this as the primordial building. He says this is the first building. And I think what he also says is that the first building consisted just of rooms, without doors. And if you want to make a room, you clear away the walls, and where you clear them away, you find pilasters. Now, I think the coffer is also a memory of that primordial. I see this as a kind of infinite blackness of matter. You see, there's two poles between which one operates. One is the infinite blackness of solid matter. The other is the infinite whiteness of translucency and light. And these are all just, architecture is simply a mediating technique. So this is, for me, the memory of a transitional stage, if you like, when rooms appeared. There's a stage beyond the coffer, which is rather important. Now, these are the columns that are left when you clear the the hyperstyle, which is the proper name for this, is the hypostilion, which is a very strange idea. It means the column that lies underground, which always, you need quite a lot of persuasion to make a client build columns that are underground. But it is true that the column underground is less expensive than the column above ground. You can put it there, you see. And this is the virtual column, probably the virtuous column. Kant talks about trying to conceive of the embodiment of space by removing a chair. Well, he doesn't say you remove a chair and sit on the floor. He says it's the space that was there when, which is there when you take the chair away, and the idea of the chair remains. Anyway, so here is a column that's taken away for obvious reasons. It's in the middle of the living room, and I found myself putting back columns of light, which I think are called the columna lucis, which sounds better. Now, this is the ground plan of this house. It's a square and so on. And it's a game played with the hyperstyle and these columns that appear and disappear, and the walls that used to be there. So all the footprints, the whole process of the making of the architecture is recorded as a kind of rhetoric and a history and a drama. And it's very, very true that in this house you do find yourself walking through columns and walls, which is quite entertaining for an architect. The building I built in America, the professor of computing refused to walk through walls that would be there. He always followed the ground plan. And this is where I started. Now, this is where the Bekleidung, the Bekleidung festoon starts. This is a strange material that I invented because I hadn't the courage to do real in situ concrete. This is only 100 mil thick, and it's made with smashing up bricks. So I wrote to the Cement and Concrete Association. Cement and Concrete. And I said, send me everything you have on making concrete with bricks. I thought I'd get a discourse on Roman concrete, and they sent me a little booklet, of which I believe they have thousands, on how to build an air raid shelter. So I've christened this Blitzkrieg, which is not a joke I normally tell in Germany. But there you are. The British are always fighting the last war. Now, the thing is, you don't have to actually decorate concrete. It's this alkali-rich surface, in a clean atmosphere, it grows the most amazing lichen. But there you are, I can't resist decoration. So, you see, we have this game that we play with columns. And here's an Egyptian wondering why this column is so big. I could never understand as a student why a hyperstyle hall had to have such enormous columns. But that's another story. Now, what I've done, I've solved the problem of the column, I think probably for all time, for the first time for 10,000 years, by walking straight through it. I've discovered that instead of saying enjoy, in Houston they say enlarge. And we made these columns 1.8 meters in diameter, and we just walk straight through them. So all planning problems are now solved, and in fact, you can open your books of Beaux-Arts planning and know it'll work. This is its iconographical significance. This is the sort of eye at the top, and this is the big female lump at the bottom. And this is the kind of horrific accident that occurred, you see, because obviously creation was an accident. But you can walk through it every time you go through one of these things. You can actually stand in and rehearse Captain Kirk's famous words, "Beam me up, Scotty," which etymologically mean beam is related to the verb to be, which is true actually, and tree as well. And skotos is of course death, So it means, make me disappear and appear in another place. But we have to rehearse these ideas rather than enact them, for the time being at least. And here are these corridors that plough around in this building. I first worked this idea out under pressure, as one always does, in the City of London, where you have to make every bit of space work for you. And so I had this idea of a kind of split column in this highly dressed building. This building actually could have been built for the same price as SOM's in Bishopsgate. It was at the top register of the boom cladding, the boom Kleidung. Now, I'll talk about this thing now, the entablature. No, I won't. Now, you see, this is an image I drew many years ago in ballpoint pen. And it shows the sort of conflict between the idea of somatic time and the idea of the time before time, or infinity. And they kind of clash, But with the walk-through column, which I call the working column, or the working order, rather, the clash is somehow resolved. So here's the entrance hall, here's the river, which is coming down. It does a sort of swerve, a sort of cubist swerve here, and turns into its tridentine delta. The delta is, the name of the delta is the Greek D. It's a triangle. That's where it comes from. And here is the ocean. And here's the hypostyle going across. So in Duncan Hall, you walk around, you walk across all these figures. And here's the column that isn't there, and it has data and power, because the origin of my columnar order was called the ordini robotico, the working order, you see. We'll come to that in a minute. These are the balustrades. I can discourse at length on the idea of the balustrade, but here's the column as a shaft of energy or light, which is one of the meanings of the Latin trabs, and so on. So you see, even this steel pipe balustrade, if you paint it, you can turn it into an iconic narrative. I don't call this art, I call it iconic engineering. Anyway, try to resist art. Right, well, we were going to do the columns as well. We did the ceiling and the floor. And in fact, we shipped out all the tiles. I'll show you in a minute. But the columns anyway are quite complicated, so I'm very pleased with my American clients. Not quite so pleased with my English ones. This is the Judge Institute, which at the last minute was kind of de-iconized, if that's the right word. We spent all the serious money and then didn't do all this. Never mind, it was a brave attempt. But here are the columns coming out of the ocean. These are the interlocking snakes, etc., etc., etc. Now, this is the technology. This isn't as technically perfect as I would wish. I mean, it works, This is a Canon color copy. What you do basically is you do a drawing, and then you tile it. It's called tiling in computing. You split it up, and then you transfer the actual powder pigment, and it's completely light fast. It's not ink. So you can make a vast composition. This is Indra's nail. These are the first rain of photons splitting the cell, and these are the chromosomes, you see. Because this is the ocean register. This is a phylogenetic and ontogenetic narrative that goes up the columns. Right, and these are some more. You see, what was nice is I would have done about 3,500 aleatory works of art, which would have more or less put paid to art, I think. Right. So here's the British building, which is kind of dumbed down, really. I mean, everybody thinks when they go into it it's incredibly rich and ornamented, but you have to go. In Texas, it's intellectually structured, because in England we tend to think if you cover a thing in wood veneer or sliced stone, you've solved the problem. Whereas in America, they know they have a synthetic culture, and they're quite eager to make sense of it. But nevertheless, the Judge is a building in which a lot of things were solved for the first time on a large scale. This is a kind of joke on the idea of the coffer, which I suppose is quite appropriate for Cambridge. Now, this is what we solved in the Judge. We solved this idea of the column being a kind of column full of machines, the ordini robotico. it always seems to satisfy my clients that you can have a column as big as you like as long as you've got machines inside it, which I suppose is all right, because I'm sure the Dorians thought they had embodied ideas, spirits, whatever, inside the column. So this is a kind of, we put the toilet ventilation inside, and this seems a modern idea of. So now in America, of course, everything inside a building is made of what they call sheetrock, and much more flimsy. But I rather like that because it's much cheaper. It cost about half the British one, and it relies entirely on its iconic structuring. So this is an entablature. An entablature in Latin is called a fereculum. It's something that actually carry about, and this has an icon of London, which is an excellent one. It's a hypostyle and a pyramid and a solar analog. And I think of it. I've told you about the coffer as a kind of phenomenological version of an evacuated solid turning into rooms. This is the coffer as this is the entablature as raft, which is, as I say, it's kind of it's lexical dimension. This building, mine, is only about 2 years older than this one. This has got a bucky ball on it. Anyway, so here's the waves, you see, that carry the raft. Now, a bit of carrying. This is the raft landing on the Judge in Cambridge. And here's some Bekleidung. Right. This is a technique for making inlaid concrete. So you carve an original. This was the first time it was done in Ireland. Now they do it flat, because this is rubber. You can't pull a rubber mold off a curved surface. I mean, you can't pull a solid mold off a curved surface. You must have it made of rubber. And then you backfill this, and it turns into that. This is the Cyma recta, which represents outer space, you see, because the waves, the cymation, occur on the horizon, and these are the stars in outer space. And this thing is a plug of sort of congealed fire, because the column is actually, it is a columna lucis. It's an empowerment. It's a kind of cubic lattice of energy. The 18th century idea that it was structure. The best thing that Buckminster Fuller did was entirely disprove that cubic structures were stable. He created this idea that triangulated structures were efficient structure. The only problem was that nobody wanted to live in a triangulatedly structured house. But never mind. And this is how it all arrives, you see. This is, coloured concrete is an amazing material. There are now new pigments which are colour fast. This blue is the first time we've had a colour fast blue. It's only been around for about 15 years. It's made of cobalt. And all contractors want to use another sort of blue called phthalocyanine, anyway, because it's much cheaper. But this is how it comes, you see. It's a whole prefabricated kit of parts in inlaid concrete. Now, this is my most recent thing, which is a sort of folly, really. It's the Millennium Veranda. But I have a very indulgent client who I did that house for, and they wanted a Millennium Veranda. So it's a small version of the walk-through column, and it has the walk-through bit, and it's black marble bit here and blue concrete and crushed green blitzcrete, and this is something new. We've never done that before. And a piece of structural cast glass, which took 5 casts to get right. You can see that was a temporary leg, and a stainless steel thing. And then this opens to let the sun in and the rain. Well, it's supposed to keep the rain out, actually. You see, it's a hollow column. This is the door. Here's this concrete. You've got lights in, and a glass rainwater pipe. We really sort of took it quite seriously, this piece of building. There's this steel armature. Right, that's it at night. So it produces its own light. There's no light shining on it. What's quite interesting is it produces its own light, and it illuminates itself, and it illuminates all its own architecture. These are, I think, the only natural material here, seriously natural, are these black marble pebbles. This blue brick was specially baked in Holland out of cobalt blue. And this is a moth that thinks it's a piece of blitzcrete. And this was how the blue was made. You see, it's all through. The colour's all through, you see. It's very serious, this. And then you get this by polishing off about 5 millimeters. This is patinated copper. Okay, and here's the lights coming out. Right, now this is the last little bit. This is about the ceiling. And you see the ceiling the room in Rice, what I called the weaving together of the varieties of time, is a microcosm. This may be the last microcosm that was built in the 20th century. But it starts, you see, with the drawing of negation, of nothingness, because obviously what came before creation was nothing. And then nothing created its double, or it had an idea of itself, or and so two nothings are impossible, so there was a kind of catastrophe, really. And there are various cosmogonies that start with what they call a wobble. So this whole ceiling is a kind of big bang, and it's a raft, the raft of the founders, you see, the raft of the colonists. And here are the mountains that have been blasted aside, you see. So it uses a lot of antique iconography and turns it into a kind of supermarket graphic. And at the same time, it just, it doesn't use Cinquecento perspective, which seems to be the only other alternative. It's a veil, in Gordana's terms. And its relationship to the coffer, you see, when you cut away the coffer, when you cut away the raft, you reveal the vault. You reveal that what's in the coffer, what's in the chest, what's above the raft, that the raft carries. And so you have to depict it. I think it's wrong to have a vaulted coffer. In fact, it's not right. So if you cut away your beams, your beloved beams, you will have to face up to the fact that you must describe something that floats above them. And this is the way it was made. This is my original watercolor, and this is a 32 times enlargement. So all we did is photograph it, scan it in, and then cut it up electronically and print it out in chunks, 2 foot by 8 foot, and wrap it around ceiling tiles. And because everything is done by computers in between painting it in watercolor in hotel bedrooms and putting it up, it all fits together again. And it's a fairly seamless picture. Here it is on the floor of the printing factory. And I just like this picture because it's so completely Bekleidung. And this is my drawing of the Ordine Robotico. You see, I have a pact with the engineering professions, which actually they find very agreeable. I show them all into my dark, my cubic lattice of ducts, and I shut the door, and they're very happy because they can work without being looked at. And these are the 3 Vitruvian categories. This is firmness, this is venustas, and this is commoditas, which, of course, commoditas is the most important one. And it comes from modus, to measure, and to achieve harmony. And the basic idea is political harmony. And that is what lies behind this strange architectural engine. Right. I have nothing to say about Semper, but anyway, perhaps this will prove provocative. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, there must be one.
Yes.
It can't be that shocking.
If you can't get Brad to ask me.
What about making things?
What?
What about making things? You seem quite happy to be hands-off, as long as you can move brain on, as it were.
Making things.
Yeah.
How do you mean in the Aristotelian sense of enacting them?
There's 4 elements where you're actually generating
what,
actually
moulding and
qualities
cutting and carving.
direct making things, whereas you seem to be quite happy to be alienated from any ontological commitment to means of making
If asked to choose, which you have to, in life you are asked to choose, I would choose for making ideas rather than making things. I mean, it's fine to make, that's why I say my ideal surface is like Pietra Dura, where the thing is made and also iconographically dense. But if asked to choose, I would use printing rather than marble. Because I find it more intellectually stimulating, How much can you say about marble? Well, I know you'd say a lot.
No, they kind of related to Semper.
Do you tell all your clients what this is about, or do they just assume that it's going to be interesting?
Well, I can tell my American clients what it's about. All the texts and millionaires who paid for that read every single word I wrote before I actually met them, whereas the English clients always apologize. They just come back from fixing their Swiss bank accounts and haven't had time to read it. Yes, the answer is that when I write it up, and I like my clients never, because in fact, you see, we got to the point in Houston where the columns were going to be clad in some kind of, iconological discourse on mathematics and whatever, computing, you see, but we never quite got that far because it takes time, You can only sort of break down one fence per project. But the answer is that in Houston, they make up their own stories about it. It's a kind of scaffolding. There's two ways of solving the problem of oppression. One is to tell all the stories, and the other is to tell none of them. So I'm in favour of telling all of them. I put it all in, and you can do what you like with it, really. I have a canonic version, but it doesn't stop Americans anyway from making their own. I think it's so much more a synthetic culture, you see, and it depends upon its philosophical underpinnings much more than Europe does. Europe has the illusion that there's something behind it all, called tradition.
Could I just sort of say that I also see a kind of a development or kind of change in what you're doing, because as I understood in your earlier work, like the Gottfried's house in time, what is happening? You had the attitude that you wanted, in terms of materials, you wanted to use concrete, for example, and then you wanted that concrete to be, as it were, concrete. You didn't want to give it a color, a dressing as such, but you wanted to have that concrete remain concrete, and if it had to be a green concrete, you made it with a green pigment. So in a way, it was done in such a way that the material stayed itself. Right? Green concrete was produced, blue concrete was produced, black concrete was produced, mixed color concrete, blitzkrieg was produced. So what, in a way, you were doing, you were, in a way, dealing with material of concrete in its various shapes and colors, but as it were, on its own. Material was transparent to itself.
Yes. Well, I think you're...
Whilst, in the later development, especially with this...
which is completely described in making the walls of glass, because then all you see is trees. So you create the cubic room, and then you frame it, literally like you frame a picture. And this framing creates a field, which is the picture plane. And the problem I see for architecture is how to invent a pictorial technique for the picture frame. And I use these sort of icons that I've filleted out of history and reused and re-enabled. So I don't mind the picture, the field, being made of prints, because it is a veil. Whereas the structure, I do quite like to keep the structure solid. And also the outside of the building, the inside. To use your words of the Muri and the Perriers, I think is quite appropriate, because I do feel the outside is something that you need to touch and feel solid and heavy and cold. But the inside has a different, is less, the imperative to make it, out of solid stone is less oppressive, I think.
Okay, so one last question.
What's the story with the Las Vegas project? When they got hijacked?
Oh, well, you see, in Las Vegas, this was the Battersea Power Station. I won the competition to redesign the Battersea Power Station. I think I was there's now another architect. There was one before that, and I was one before that. And it goes off. We christened it the Grimpen Mire, because everyone we talked to had been burnt. I think I'm the only architect who actually had his fees paid. We won it, and we did a fantastic design, actually, and the Chinese owner really loved it. He called it the Forbidden City. The thing is, I went to Vegas, I went to LA, and I was shown around all these guys. There are no architects left in Vegas. Everything is made of polystyrene above this height. Below that, it's made of asbestos cement. It's made by film set designers, big contractors, and illustrators, and the people I call the barons of hokum. People like Steve Wynn, who get up in the morning and say, "It's Paris." But the thing is that nothing is... originality, you see, is a mistake now in Vegas. That's very curious. I was shown around, and anything I thought was just vaguely interesting, they said, "Oh no, it's wrong. It has no style." So in Vegas now, you have to have a book. You have a big library at home, called Monaco and Venice, and then you choose the style for the job. You sell it to the client, and it's all made of hand-carved polystyrene. So, I mean, my idea for it was a vast hypostyle hall, 600 feet by 600 feet, made of quatrefoil columns. And the thing about the quatrefoil column, they were 10 feet, 3 meters in diameter. The two loads would rotate, you see. So it would either be a wonderfully middle-class architectural monstrosity, or an all-singing and dancing machine. Do you know there's a thing called mechanical cabaret? I got them along, you see. They were going to do all the bits that went mad and on the hour, every hour, it's called shop-attainment. You move the people around the thing, you see. But it was too sophisticated for them.
We're sorry. Thank you very much.